I'm Stephanie Beloris, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I'm joined by Vice President and Principal Analyst Jeff Pollard and Principal Analyst Jess Byrne to discuss the future of the CISO. Welcome both.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks very much.
So the future of the CISO, originally you both wrote this research back in 2020. There was the original report, The Future of the CISO. You know, it's been 4+ years later, so we're refreshing the research. Let's start right there. So as you worked on the update of this research, what has changed about the CISO? And for those who aren't steeped in the day-to-day of the security industry, CISO is Chief Information Security Officer. So Jeff, I'm going to start with you. What's changed?
So although I don't know that I would have predicted it back in 2020, the importance of the role has only gotten more important. So it's risen in terms of prominence and importance, partly because of customer demand, right? Customers are now asking way more about security than they ever have before, especially in a B2B context. But that's also true in the B2C world from partners and suppliers. In addition, I think the other thing that has really changed is that there's a lot more scrutiny around the role of the CISO, and there are a lot more legal implications in that role than what we had seen going back to 2020. At one point, it was kind of like if you were a CISO and your company suffered a breach, yeah, you ran the risk of being a sacrificial lamb, but that was kind of where it started and stopped. You just kind of look for another job and it's sort of okay, and you kind of expected that. But with SEC scrutiny, SEC rules in particular, and things like SEC action against SolarWinds and Brown, the CISO, which was largely tossed out, and rightfully so, the actual legal risk and ramifications of being a CISO has heightened in intensity, which has led to a lot of security leaders to kind of sit back and think, is this what I want to be doing? If I'm at risk of this kind of jeopardy, maybe it's time to exit this role altogether. So if anything, it got more difficult, it became more important, and it has more scrutiny than it did even in years past.
Right. So you've got more budgets, more power, more influence. Most of these are dotted line into the report. They're definitely reporting to a C-level executive. It's either the CIO or it's a business C executive. But then along with that has come a whole bunch of scrutiny. And you said they're less of the easy scapegoat, but they're still under a lot of pressure though. Like you mentioned, you've had CISOs being personally held liable for company actions. So I guess that was my thought, which is like, who wants to be the CISO?
Yeah, I think we've been calling it, CISOs in a time of personal liability, right? So we've been advising for the past couple of years a number of things, especially in our annual program recommendations document. When we talk about, one of the things we wrote in 2022 is lawyer up, right? Retain personal counsel. So for people who are still very invested in the mission, you just have to think a little bit more about self-preservation than you did. According to Jeff's point earlier, you could always go get a new job. Not exactly as easy this time. So you need to think about, one, what it means for you personally and your own personal liability, because CISOs, in many cases are still glorified directors, right? Some of the same protections and shields that other C-level executives or stakeholders have don't apply to CISOs. D&O insurance is one of them in many cases. So think about what it means to negotiate yourself a golden parachute is another thing that we advised. Get that personal liability lawyer, and also start thinking about how you can create a paper trail that outlines those program gaps, that shines a light on those program gaps, and make sure that everybody knows about them, so it isn't just all on you. And the scapegoating is a little bit more difficult. Doesn't make you the most popular person in the room, but I don't know if CISOs ever were. I think they fought really hard to get in there, and now they have to figure out new ways to stay in the room.
Yeah, it's interesting because if I remember some of your research correctly, most CISOs want to stay CISOs. Like they're not looking to make the jump to CIO or potentially other roles in IT. They came up through the security ranks. They're passionate about security, and they intend to be in security. So it's like, okay, once you've reached the pinnacle, you're either going to stay here or, I guess you could always like jump ship and go into like consulting. But for the most part, it seems like CISOs, once they get there, they want to be CISOs.
Yeah, I think most CISOs want to stay in that operating capacity at least for a while. Some do exit and become founders. That's actually one of the things that we discuss in this report in the original version, as well as what's happening now, which is that, one of the valid exit strategies for CISOs is not just that CIO path, not just the consulting, but it's also, is there an opportunity for you to become a founder? Have you solved security problems with your teams? And now maybe it's time to start something up to help other security leaders out. And of course, we do see some starting to exit and go to the vendor world as an evangelist or architect of some sort. Field CISO often is another title that you'll see out there. But I think that for a number of CISOs, what we've really tried to help them do is A, figure out their type, B, try to figure out what the organization is looking for and if there's a match there, and see how their type evolves over time. You might start out as one type and then become a different type of CISO. And that's perfectly acceptable. We find a lot of security leaders do that, where maybe earlier in their career, they want the most exciting, challenging opportunities out there. And, as they get closer and closer to retirement, they might be very comfortable in more of a steady state type of role where it's not necessarily a transformational type of opportunity.
You mentioned CISO types. So in the report, there's 6 CISO types, and this was originally identified in the first report. Now in the update, I'm curious, and Jess, maybe you could speak to this. What are those 6 types, and then which of them have changed the most from 2020 to 2024?
Yeah, so we've got 6. We've got the post-breach CISO. We've got customer-facing, steady state, tactical and operational, transformational, which we've been talking quite a bit about, and then compliance and risk focused. And so these did exist in the original research, but what we decided to do when we went about refreshing this research was actually pull job postings. So we analyzed 100 CISO job postings that we found via LinkedIn and Indeed, I believe. And we hand grouped them into each of these 6 CISO types, with the exception of post-breach, because I think that comes out a little later in the interview process, or someone is actually going to know that they're applying for a role at a company that just had a breach. But we got those job descriptions. We fleshed out the typical characteristics with what we saw there. And, some job descriptions have standard boilerplate language, but it was pretty easy for us to see, based on what was in the job description, the information on the company itself, what the reporting structure looked like, the potential compensation range. It gave us some valuable clues as to what type of CISO that company was looking for. So for the 100 postings, the most prevalent that we found was for a compliance or risk focused CISO, which is really interesting. But it makes sense, right? Because as we've discussed, the regulatory landscape constantly changing, new mandates, new standards, new litigation, new ways to do class action lawsuits, all coming at CISOs by region, by industry. So you really do need a leader that's well steeped in keeping up with relevant regulations. And this is valuable. And Jeff, I believe you called this era regulatory FOMO, right? Maybe talk more about that.
It's definitely the era of regulatory FOMO. It's sort of like if you are a cabinet department, a department under a cabinet department, a department that might be a cabinet department in a government that doesn't have cabinet departments, or whatever. If you don't have a cybersecurity regulation, you're going to add one. And it doesn't matter what region, what geography, what vertical, what segment. It seems like they're everywhere now. And it's not too surprising that a lot of organizations are looking for security leaders that have either navigated that successfully in their sort of past lives, or are very familiar with navigating it now, which makes them an attractive candidate. I think the overall leaders that we do find most often, in general, from a security perspective, from a self-identification standpoint, so not the job rec, but kind of psychologically, what do CISOs think of themselves? I think we find a lot of security leaders that are transformational security leaders. So they're program builders. They want to come in and help build out a security program, take a program from start to finish. Sometimes that's the idea of kind of going back on all those prior mistakes and getting them right this time. So sort of getting out of your own tech debt or security debt that you might have created in other organizations. And then one that I'm really passionate about is the customer facing CISO, which we do find a lot in high tech and B2B tech in particular, which is a CISO that spends most of their time on customer facing activities. And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about that role and that entity is one of the things that we found. This is one of my favorite parts of working here at Forrester, is that we have an entire body of research related to B2B sales, for example. And in that, we do a lot of data collection. We run surveys. And so we found that the average B2B sales rep in a given week spends a little over 10 hours on customer facing activity, right? Actually presenting, doing lead generation, demand gen, et cetera, and trying to find prospects. Well, guess how much time those customer-facing CISOs spend per week talking to customers about security issues? It's about 10 hours. So those customer-facing CISOs are spending pretty much as much time talking to customers as your average B2B sales rep, which is kind of fascinating. So I'm also pretty passionate about that role because I think every security leader is now becoming a little bit of a customer-facing security leader because you just have to, because customers are so focused on it.
Did you think about the customer-facing CISO? And I agree with you. I mean, that's an exciting role. At the same time, though, I kind of wonder, does it start to change the definition of what a CISO is? So I'm thinking, for example, like Microsoft actually just announced their Secure Future initiative, and they've appointed 13 deputy CISOs, one for every, major product/functional area and all of engineering. So that's great, but is that a CISO? The way we would historically think of a CISO.
Yeah, Jess, I want you to chime in on this because I think functionally those are BISOs.
Those are BISOs.
I think those are, right? Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, those feel more in line with BISOs. And I was actually thrilled to see that announcement. I was actually thrilled to read the update today that said all those folks are in place now, all 13 of them. But they're really there to be the liaison between the CISO and those lines of business and those specific functions to make sure that security is not an afterthought. Security is, if the CISO can't be at every table, even if they are invited, right? They can't be there. So those BISOs are there in their stead. They're there to represent security, and then they're there to represent the business back to the security organization and make sure that requirements are met and make sure, that security is baked into all products and services that are being offered, and as well as protecting the enterprise. So BISOs play a really, really pivotal role and a really creative one too, because they're not there to say no. They're there to say, in the terms of improv, yes and make sure that people consider security when they're coming up with new initiatives.
In a lot of organizations, BISO may not be enough of a title.
Mm-hmm.
And Microsoft certainly being a very large company, right? There are sometimes title things that you have to do where calling that a business information security officer as a BISO may not be sufficient. And that person needs the deputy CISO title in order to sort of have the respect or or authority that might convey that needs to be conveyed in that. And I think that's part of the reason why. But we are also seeing that become more common. If you're sort of in the financial services world, you hear the term BISO, you think, awesome. Thank you for the last 10, 15, 20 years of my life. I'm familiar with this role. But when you get outside of financial services, you find that role is not nearly as common or prevalent, and it's relatively new and being introduced to other companies, whether it's functionally a BISO or deputy CISO. It is very much that role of kind of acting as a business manager and interface for that group with the rest of the security program.
And it's an excellent career path for a CISO that could be transformational, that could be customer facing, right? That could be post breach because they've been through it at this capacity for a particular business unit within an organization. Same for deputy CISO, unless they're solely focused on managing the employees, right? The security team. These are all great, ladders up for security practitioners that are looking for their next move.
So one more question about the customer-facing CISO before we go back to the other two, because I'm curious to follow up on the transformational CISO and the risk and compliance CISO. So the customer-facing CISO, again, if he or she are out on the road interfacing with customers, being more involved in actual product security, I would assume then that they've still got somebody back within the corporate environment who really is the operational CISO, if you will.
They absolutely have to have a very, very strong organizational chart. They've got to have that deputy that they can count on to run the shop when they're focused on those other activities, because there is more travel, there is more direct interfacing. They are sometimes playing a part directly in the sales process as someone that steps in once things are qualified, if customers have questions. So yeah, it does place a huge emphasis on their direct reports, on their teams of having the folks that are empowered, authoritative, and responsible enough to run that so they can focus and emphasize on this other part of their role.
Sounds to me like maybe that individual should be the chief trust officer and then leave the CISO to be the CISO.
We've seen some of that happen. In fact, in that B2B and tech world that we talked about, that's where the chief trust officer was sort of born. And that's where we see a lot of CISOs moving into that role, which is more customer facing, something that we've talked about at prior Forrester security and risk events as one potential career path for security leaders. Yeah.
So the risk and compliance. So I mean, I hear you. We hear risk and compliance. It's like, it doesn't sound all that exciting. However, like you said, it actually could be very high profile and high risk for them, if depending on the industry, with all of the different scrutiny from the SEC, new regulations, new executive orders here in the U.S. et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
you imagine it's somebody who just spends their day cross-referencing.
Quantifying things.
Yeah, cross-referencing controls across various different regulations. But actually, no, it could be something far more interesting.
Oh yeah, and it could even be a post breach type CISO, depending on what the organization is looking for. So either post breach, or organizations might look for a compliance risk expert if they want to expand operations into a new geography, and they just don't, they don't know how to operate without running afoul of regulations. And then of course a good compliance and risk CISO can use that regulatory FOMO to further their programs, right? One of the things that Jeff's written about and talked about in past forums is using regulations, amongst other things, to get budget, right? To make sure that you're able to operate in a region. If you're going to be able to do this, then you need to do X, Y, and Z in terms of controls and investments in people and technology. So Jeff, I don't know if you want to expand on that, because I think that's really important for a CISO to know.
And speaking of the future of the CISO, I think that this is the most sought after, sort of archetype right now. And I think it will continue to be, because we aren't seeing a let up in the amount of regulation that's passed out there. So if you're a CISO, or you're looking to make your way into that role, becoming an in-depth expert on any of these regulatory frameworks that security teams are being hit with, whether it's NIS2, DORA, AI, RMF, like whatever it is, even things that aren't specific to security, it's not a bad thing. It will keep you eminently employable, because companies are always going to be challenged by navigating these types of issues. And if you've proven that you can build and run a security program successfully by navigating through these various regulatory minutia, that's a heck of a thing to have on your resume. So you're right, Steph. I think I don't know that anyone grows up and says, I want to be a compliance and risk focused CISO, but I will tell you that anyone that did grow up and become one is never without a job for very long, and probably has their choice of what they want to do when they want to do it.
Yeah. So the third one, the transformational CISO, I mean, when you guys were talking about it, is this individual transforming the security practice, or do they have to be a CISO at an organization that is going through a massive transformation?
Turns out it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Jess, do you want to dive into this one?
Yeah, sure. So this was the second most prevalent of the 100 job postings that we looked at. And it's certainly one that we hear about all the time. We talk to folks that are in the middle of transformations all the time. And this is also where I think the post-breach CISO needs would likely surface in the hiring and interview process, as this type of CISO is coming in to enact real change in the organization. Few years ago, 5 or so years ago, this may have been the first named security leader in an organization, but more often than not now, this is someone who's coming in to do a much needed overhaul of the security program. They are likely to have more goodwill at the outset with the execs. They may also be more likely to report to the CEO. They are going to have the ears of line of business leaders, and may have an easier time being louder about those program gaps that they've surfaced, and getting the necessary budget to fill them. So they really do work best at an organization where they are able to completely overhaul things or build from scratch. But again, that's a little more rare these days.
And what we tend to find is that one of the concerns out there is that if you are this type of leader, if this is what excites you, if this is kind of your joy, your why, your passion, then if you're dealing with a company that says it wants a transformational leader, but you can tell through the process that this company is not ready for transformation. There's nothing in their market making them transform. There's nothing in their product set, their customer desires. There's really no kind of externalities that are forcing transformation. It may not be a really good choice to walk in if you're this kind of leader, because what you'll find is they might say they want transformation, but in reality, they really want someone that's much more steady state, that can take the program, improve it a little bit, but just kind of keep things running. And I think that when this is what you enjoy, it can create some misalignment and lead to some bad options for you and the company.
So it's interesting. We actually started talking a little bit about career development, and we talked a lot about the career exits when you're like, okay, I'm done. Thank you. I'm out of here. Be a founder, maybe go into consulting. I suppose a few are looking for other IT roles, but usually not. What have we seen in terms of the skills? Like, are they, for the most part, they're still coming up through the ranks, but are we seeing anything different in terms of either education, skills that they go out and acquire? I mean, for a little while, you kind of seen that dual degree where they had some sort of undergrad in information security or in general IT, and then they matched that with an MBA of some sort. Are we still seeing that kind of, let me marry business and IT skill sets together, or is anything changed? I'm just had like, are they? At one point I felt like CISOs were racking up the certifications, just everyday security professionals. Like, let me see how many acronyms I can fit on my resume.
Oh my goodness, yes. And your email signature is just 5 lines long. But yeah, the interesting thing is that there are still some pretty, unfortunately, hard requirements for education and for certifications for folks at all levels of a security organization. But what we found when we looked at these job postings, which I thought was interesting, is that in terms of required, let's say a bachelor's, for example, it was the tactical and operational CISO that had 89% of those had a bachelor's required there. Whereas when you're looking at something more like a risk and compliance guru, it's down to 65. So it really depends. Certifications, for steady state, we're actually fairly low on the requirements list. I think almost everybody's expected to have some of the standard C certifications that are out there, like CISSP. But it really depends now on how you're getting into security itself, right? If you're coming in with a legal and a risk and compliance background, I don't know if it matters, right? They're hiring you for a specific reason. You're hiring you for your experience, and if they want somebody who's going to help you get through NIST 2 and DORA, then you might be the right person for that role, regardless of whether you have a CISSP or not.
There was a time, and I don't know if this is still true, where I did see people jump from other roles within IT into the CISO. Like I knew one CISO who had been the SVP of a sourcing and vendor management group, which, okay, hey, I'm really good at assessing third-party risk. Maybe I can apply that to the rest of security. Are we seeing that? Or is that just, again, with like the importance and the scrutiny on security, like, no, that's over with. You're not hopping over from another part of IT. Like, you're coming up through the ranks, or you're coming in with this specialized background with risk and compliance.
I think we're seeing it require a little bit more specialization than we've seen in the past. Yeah. It used to be sort of that, in the early days of being a CISO, the joke was kind of you were promoted CISO because everyone else stood still and everyone else stepped back.
In soccer or lacrosse.
Yeah, you were the one standing still, and sort of like everyone else stepped back and you were like, wait, what just happened? I think that now it is a little bit more intentional. I think that for people outside of security, the role can seem really enticing and exciting. I think for people in security, it can seem that way as well, at least the first time. Maybe they get tricked once and then they're not so sure after the fact. What's the old version of the acronym is CISO stands for career is suddenly over. That sort of thing that's been a joke through the years. So I think you see less of the sort of non-security person that grew up inside the industry gravitating towards that role now because of the degree of specialization, because of the requirements, because of the jeopardy attached to the role with what we've seen recently. I think it's made it where it's a little bit more insular in terms of we need to get someone that has a background within security to some extent. I think generally we think of that as often a security operations background, which I think is where a lot of CISOs came from. But there are tons of CISOs that also came up from GRC roles or third-party audit because they knew how to negotiate between IT and security, which is a really valuable skill set for a CISO that sits between those various groups. But I think it's become a little bit more insular now that you're generally going to pull a CISO from someone that has experience operating a security program. For example, to Jess's point about the stats, when you look at the compliance and risk expert, CISO type, we generally find that they also have more experience than others. It's generally around a little over 9 years of experience, which is about 1.5 years more than some of the other CISO roles require in terms of the job posting. So they just want someone that's been around and run security programs substantially more than maybe other CISO types even.
Yeah, so it's not so much hopping from function to function, it's hopping from company to company, right? Like people really want someone who's done this before and probably has been through something catastrophic before as well. That's a bonus.
Yeah. How has the tenure changed? I mean, I remember, I think it might have been the 2020 report where the tenure was fairly short. In my mind, it kind of screamed like, yeah, hire you, then chew you up and spit you out, move on to the next CISO that we can burn out. Has it changed?
At least in terms of the Fortune 500, CISOs are now sort of at parity with other C-level executives. So the average CISO tenure is a little over 4 years, the same as we see for CEOs, CMOs, et cetera. I think one good thing that's a result of that is we've seen that sort of myth of the 2-year tenure busted a bit. It isn't quite the same as it used to be. You're getting a lot more time to kind of stand up and run your program. So we are seeing they have a lot of parity with other C-level executives. Of course, CISOs have those kind of resume generating events where they might be the sacrificial lamb. Also, CISOs have a lot more opportunities now, which is another positive, right? It used to be that, there weren't that many CISO gigs, but now tons of companies have CISO roles open. That's part of what we were able to find by these job requisitions, and how we were able to profile them. And so that gives CISOs more opportunity too, to try out different roles and different types and jump from, different opportunities when things may not be what they want it to be.
Has anything changed in the mix of, and I don't know if we did it in this research or prior research, has anything changed in the mix of, you mentioned like the Fortune 500, the mix of women or people of color in the CISO role, or has it been pretty much static? Generally speaking, it's been, at least my experience, that if IT itself has made some overall progress, security tends to be lagging in that progress.
That's definitely what we've seen. So when we look at CISO career paths and other research we've done, what we found is that security is still a laggard when it comes to sort of any kind of aspects of gender parity or equality. And so it still is held back. I think some sub 20% of Fortune 500 CISOs are women. I think one of the most interesting things that we found is that when the CISO is paired with another woman in the C-suite, not just the CIO, but any other sort of woman within a C-suite role, their tenure is substantially longer than if there isn't another woman in the C-suite. It's about a sort of 20 to 30% difference in the average tenure of security leaders that have someone else in the C-suite of their gender versus those that don't have that, when they're the only C-level leader, which is really interesting to see that it's not just good enough to sort of promote one person, pat yourself on the back and say, we've achieved some kind of equality here. Instead, there's got to be some parity across the board, because it can't be just an effort in sort of tokenization or whatever it might be. It's got to be a commitment from the organization.
And that may be something for you too to consider as you're examining these roles. Like, do I really want to work here?
Yep, absolutely.
Well, I know you both are going to be covering this topic at our Security and Risk Summit in December in Baltimore. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be presenting on.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm so looking forward to this event in December, as we created not only a full track of content for our CISO clients and attendees and our security leader clients and attendees, which we're both going to be speaking at, but we also have an exclusive executive leadership exchange programming that's specifically for CISOs. And this is just such a great opportunity for leaders to speak with each other and gain those really priceless peer-to-peer insights that can only come from events like this, designed to bring leaders together. So as we said, I'm going to be presenting our updated Future of the CISO research, which I'm really looking forward to, in the leadership track. And then that's being followed by a CISO panel led by VP and Group Director Laura Ketzel, who is an excellent moderator. And we have 3 CISOs from different industries and representing different CISO types. So I think my talk and Laura's panel are really going to be about helping CISOs better understand themselves and play to their strengths when it comes to not only moving their programs forward, but moving their careers forward and thinking about their own next steps. And I know, Jeff, you've got a really compelling track in the leadership track as well, or talk in the leadership track.
Yeah, so I'll be talking about one of the skills that I think separates sort of actual C-level executives from each other, and something I think security leaders are still trying to get their arms around, which is the ability to forecast what is coming next for your security program across all different data types, across headcount, across incidents, et cetera. So I'm going to work on, I have research kind of coming out that's going to help security leaders work through solving that problem, where they can start to forecast beyond saying, well, bad things happen this year, we expect more bad things next year, so we better stay good, instead of kind of linking that to what the rest of the organization is doing and what its implications are on the security program. And in the other talk I'll be giving, someone made the mistake of putting me in the risk track, which I'm very excited about, because I'm not locked in there with them. They're locked in there with me. But I'll be talking about the SEC disclosure requirements around materiality. We actually went through and kind of searched and analyzed every single 10K, 8K, 10Q that's been published in the last year plus, to see what's been actually filed to meet item 105 and 106 requirements from the SEC. And we've done a huge data deep dive on that. And I'll be presenting on that to give some clues around what does materiality look like? What are common security programs doing? So super excited to share the details of that research at our event in December. It's going to be fantastic, and hope folks can make their way there.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been great to be back.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.